Welcome, everybody. This is a challenge for me. All you educators in the room, you professors, you've been doing this for like 18 months, right? So I'm not used to looking at both a screen and a real live audience. So please bear with me. But thank you so much to the folks here in the audience at the Kenworthy Performing Arts Center for being here, and for the really lovely group that's assembled on Zoom. I am very excited to welcome you to How It's Going, How It Started, which is a series of programs that the Latah County Historical Society is presenting over the next several months in collaboration with the Idaho Humanities Council, which has provided some funding, and with a lot of help from my friends over at Washington State University's History Department. My name is Dulcie Kirsting-Lark. I'm the Executive Director of the Latah County Historical Society. And I happen to get my master's degree in public history at Washington State. And when I was there, I had the opportunity to be a teaching assistant for this new class called Roots of Contemporary Issues, which is now a course that all freshmen, incoming freshmen, take at WSU. So it really changed the way I understood history, the practice of history, how historians can be useful to their communities. That's getting to be a few years ago that I graduated from grad school. And since that time, I thought, man, I really wish I could bring that concept to a broader public audience, people who aren't necessarily freshmen at WSU anymore. So the impetus really was that a series of books was just recently published by some of the faculty that teach in that program, the RCI program at WSU. Oxford Press published a set of 5 books about different topics that have been taught within the Roots of Contemporary Issues coursework. And I'm really, really pleased to have several of those scholars here with us over the next few months. Our first speaker is Dr. Phoenix, and she's presenting on a very timely topic. If you are on here on Zoom and you're not muted, if you wouldn't mind muting yourself, that would be helpful. I know, Zoom gets away from me all the time. But I do want to introduce Dr. Phoenix. She specializes in the US and world during the Progressive Era and of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in May 2010. Her doctoral work used the U.S. Women's Christian Association as a case study to explore U.S. attempts at cultural imperialism. In case studies that range from religion and missions in India to health education in the Philippines, to architecture and space in Buenos Aires, Argentina, to race-blind feminism in Nigeria, Phoenix examined the ways that US YWCA secretaries envisioned themselves as being progressive and egalitarian, even as they could not escape their progressive era US mindsets. She's currently adding the US YWCA's efforts to build a type of the transnational feminism in post-World War I Poland for the book manuscript. Her article, A Social Gospel for India, was published in a special issue on transnational women's and gender history in the Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era in spring 2014. Phoenix has presented papers at regional and national conferences such as the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians, the American Historical Association, and the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations. We're really lucky to have Karen here with us this evening, and so please help me in welcoming her.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Dulce for having us here and having me here tonight. As I was putting together the presentation, I thought I would do it a little bit differently. Some of this material does come from my book as part of this series called Gender Rules. So I'm just going to set my timer on my watch here so I don't talk for too long, as I have a tendency to do. So some of it does come from my book, but given the ongoing and evolving situation in Afghanistan, I wanted to really center that as a key part of the talk. And so what I'm going to talk about here is basically 3 lessons that I think history can give us as we look at particularly women's issues and the status of women in Afghanistan now under the Taliban. So I'll go through these kind of three things as we get to them. See if I can work a Mac. Okay. So you have probably seen pictures of the protests that Afghan women have been making. These pictures of demonstrations are on the right, or sorry, on the left. But what you haven't probably seen are pictures like the one on the right. And these are women who at least say, and are publicly saying, and we can discuss their potential motives for this, but they're saying that they support the Taliban's efforts. This is an Agence France, which is the newswire for France, basically. And it's Afghan women rally in support of the Taliban, particularly in the context of university education. So having separate areas in classrooms and universities for men and women students. So this is kind of the starting point, right? What's going on today? And that was my beginning point with this as well. And as I said, I'm going to really highlight three assumptions that I think we tend to make when we're viewing these types of events, and that history teaches us we should be a little bit cautious about these. The first thing is that we tend to view what we call the Middle East, which is a broad and kind of amorphous area. Sometimes we term that as being the same as Islamic areas, but there are large parts of Southeast Asia, for example, that are Islamic, but not part of what we would consider the Middle East. There's a tendency for us to view these areas through the lens of what scholars have called Orientalism. And this term goes to Edward Said in his book of the same title, which is not without controversy. I want to acknowledge that. It's not without controversy, but it set up these kind of initial arguments about the ways that we in the West, Europe and the United States in particular, view people of the Middle East, in quotes, and Islamic people in general. And for our purposes, there are a couple of different aspects of this. And they're really crystallized. Said talks about this in terms of art, and art is a good way to look at these. So these are two very famous, very prominent French painters, Jean-Léon Gérôme and Eugène Delacroix. And these are actually not, and I will say this, these are not the raciest of the paintings. There are many more that are where the figures are much more sexualized, especially women, than these. So these are kind of on the tame end of it. But you can see the obvious sexual overtones here. In the Gérôme, we have a naked young man. And there's an important distinction here between nude and naked. All right, nude is the study of the human body and its sort of artistic qualities. Naked is meant to be more titillating. And Gérôme actually got in trouble for this because nudes that are too realistic are naked, right? And so, but the very realism here is that he's naked. In a court of men, so this is a homosocial space, a space where all of the people in it are of the same gender. Same type of thing with the Delacroix. These are women in their apartment, meant to kind of evoke the harem and women's leisure, their unproductivity, their sequestration don't even know how to pronounce that, being sequestered, right, away from the world. These are fictions. They're fantasies that were created by these two French painters, and many other French painters do the same types of things. In the Jérôme, this is a composite. This is not a scene that would ever have taken place. It's a mishmash of Egyptian and Turkish, Ottoman Empire references. Delacroix never would have been allowed in an actual harem. So he actually uses French prostitute as models for his figures here. So these are fantasies, and that's one of the hallmarks of Orientalism, is that they are fantasies. The second, though, is that they are presented as authentic truth. So this isn't easily distinguished if you don't know what the Middle East actually looks like, right? This can be your image of it. Other elements are that the people in these paintings and representations of people who are in the Middle East are that they are timeless and unchanging, but they're not timeless and unchanging in our world today. They're stuck in the past, right? So and it's interesting how much even today we kind of succumb to this Orientalist narrative. When I was watching, for example, the Arab Spring and the Egyptian protests around Tahrir Square, I was surprised, even after years of study, that, you know, it looked so modern, right? You expect Egypt to be the pyramids because we tend to view things, again, through this Orientalist lens. Okay. So I want to talk about this not only from a kind of theoretical perspective, but I want to also ground this in some specific case studies. And the first case study that I want to talk about is Algeria. So the French invaded Algeria in 1830, and this was largely an attempt by the king to secure his kingdom. This is, you know, start a foreign war that will unify the people, and that secures your place in the politics. It didn't. He was deposed 2 weeks later. But the public overwhelmingly supported the war. And Algeria would go through different facets of having this kind of relationship with France. Initially, there was debate about would it actually be an extension of the French state, or would it become then a colony separate from France as a unit, which is what happened. And then you may know or remember that there was a bloody revolution and kind of civil war in Algeria until it gained its independence. So we've got a sort of 100 years plus of French rule going on here. And the way that the French dealt with Algeria was through this lens of gender and Orientalism. French officials tended to lump everyone together, even though there were population differences. There's a substantial Jewish population in Algeria, which they just sort of ignored and saw everybody as Muslim. And they tended to stereotype both men and women as being this kind of hypersexual, like we see in these images. So for example, Edouard Duchenne's 1853 study on prostitution in the city of Algiers since the conquest, he talked about the significant numbers of Arab prostitutes in the city that was indicative of, quote, the debased moral state of the indigenous population, the product of Islamic legal and socio-sexual practices, end quote, in which girls were married young, had several children, and then whose husbands divorced them, and they were thus kind of turned out on the street. Duchenne argued that this was both the North African climate and this sequestering and veiling of women that encouraged men to both view them in this kind of hypersexualized way. It was also the hotter climate in which, quote, passions run higher. The traditions of sequestering women in harems meant that, according to Duchenne, hypersexual young men also had no outlet for their passions than to other men. So again, there's this idea that everybody is just hypersexualized. The women, because they're sequestered, and then it's an odd argument to make, but the men, because they both have access to too many women and multiple wives in the harem, but then no access to other women, which causes them to have these apparently homosexual tendencies. Okay. I'm going to move on to the second case study. We can come back. I have lots more information on that, but I want to make sure that I make it through everything. So if you're interested in that, we can talk about it more in the questions and answer. The second thing that I think is a caution from history is that we remove the possibility of consent. That we tend to look at pictures like the women in the veils and the burqas in that right-hand picture that I started with. We look at them as dupes or as not having any agency, not being able to control their actions or what they do. And the historical example that I have for that is sati, which was a practice done by a small sect of very upper caste Hindus, Brahmins, in India. But in the publications, in the rhetoric or discourse of English East India Company officials and English missionaries, British missionaries who were in India, sati really comes to be a marker for the savagery of Indians writ large, Hindus writ large, and especially Hindu men. So sati is the practice of a widow self-immolating, so throwing herself on her husband's funeral pyre. It's intended to be something that is a mark of religious kind of fervor, and it's almost like a martyrdom in the way that we would see this as Christian martyrs. I'll get to in a minute. British officials saw this as also martyrdom, but in a kind of twisted and inverted ways. This is one of the famous wood carving illustrations that appeared in a British missionary named James Pegg. His book, and you can see this you can see his attitude about this from the title, right? India's cries to British humanity relative to infanticide, British connection with idolatry, Gao murders, sati, slavery, and colonization in India. So really kind of looking at British officials looking at Indian and Hindu Indians in particular as being savage and brutal, right? Again, using that lens of Orientalism. So sati has actually kind of a complicated history within India and within British colonial efforts. So initially, India was taken over kind of piecemeal by the British East India Company. And they were not particularly concerned with sati as long as it didn't interfere with business. They're primarily focused on business. They view it as a disturbing religious practice, but they're not really going to do anything concrete about it. Missionaries come into India in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and they're the ones who really draw focus to the practice of sati. So the British East India Company puts out a memo in 1813 that stated that sati was a practice to be respected unless, and here's the long list of qualifiers, the widow was less than 16 years old, she was pregnant, she was intoxicated, or in any other way coerced. And there's the rub, coercion, right? How do you tell if somebody is being coerced? And this was the problem. It's partly a problem at this point in British East India because of the logistics. There are not that many East India Company British officials on the ground. Most of India is not a cool place. So keeping a body is basically going to be cremated in about 24 hours. So you have to have a British official nearby. He has to be able to get to the site of cremation, and he has to verify that the widow, if she is going to throw herself on her husband's funeral pyre, that she has not been coerced. So one of the reasons that I chose this particular engraving is that you can see on the right-hand side the two missionaries who are turning away from this scene. Okay. What they decide, the way that this works out on the ground is that there are almost no circumstances in which the British official, the male British official, will decide that the woman has not been coerced. There's no such thing as voluntary in this context. During the first draft of the Indian Penal Code, for example, drafted between 1835 and 1838, it included this odd category of, and I'm quoting here, voluntary culpable homicide by consent. And it's a very twisted and legalese way of saying, right, if you are a widow and you throw yourself on your husband's funeral pyre, you are guilty of your own murder. Yeah, so this applied when a person was above 12 years of age and, quote, suffers death or takes the risk of death by his own choice. And again, consent is only valid if there was no coercion, intoxication, here we add passion, derangement, or deception. So again, there is no choice here. And what we see about the larger forces that are going on here is that this is a debate, this ends up being a debate between British official colonial men and Hindu elite men. Nobody asks the women what's going on here. And this ends up being really something that gender is used, and this lack of women's choice is used to justify British continued colonization. As one scholar has said, this is about white men protecting brown women from brown men, right? Okay. So our third case, and this is where we get a little bit tangled, is the idea of speaking for, not with. The danger of speaking for, not with. And this is where we get into a little bit of the personal is political, right? And I will tell you now, I'm a feminist. I believe in women's rights. So I'm not castigating these women, these British women who I'm going to be talking about, for their feminism. I'm castigating them for it being this kind of single-minded, and for not working with the women that they're trying to help. And that's a consistent problem, consistent challenge, I think, for feminists, especially like me, white feminists, in the past as in today. So wasn't just white male colonial officials who were in on the sati debate. British feminists were also in this debate, and particularly because it revolves around religion. Between February 1829 and March 1830, when we have the beginnings of the sati debates really heating up in England, 14 women's groups sent petitions to Parliament to abolish sati. And this was part of what's broadly called a women's mission to women. It's tied England to the colonies, but it also gave women a forum to move out of what we think of as the domestic sphere, so this kind of home and family. It gave them a way to speak in public, which we don't think of today as being abnormal, but it was in the early 1800s in both the US and in England. There's an entire book about women's movements in New England that's titled Learning to Stand and Speak, which tells you how unusual this was. In a 1814 appeal for funds, the text of this appeal opened up with an attempt to create kind of universalizing experience of women as mothers, which created this kind of fictional bond between English women and Indian women. And this is worth reading out, so I'm going to read out a pretty long quote here. And it's in, I apologize, it's in early 1800s language, so, oh, okay, sorry. So it says, quote, "Let the anxiously fond mother who trembles lest her tender offspring should, by a wise but inscrutable of their early years." So imagine mothers this, the death of your husband. For a moment, endeavor to realize the poignant anguish which must rend the breast of that other, who in the decrease of her children's best support, hears the summons for her to forsake them. So imagine you've just lost your children's best provider. And imagine now that you as the mother who is left, hear the call to forsake them as well. At a time too, when they most need her fostering care, and to immolate herself on her husband's funeral pile. The affecting representation excites our sympathy. Let it stimulate our exertions, right? So fancy 1800s language aside, put yourself in the place of this Indian woman, because she's a mother just like you, and she's being forced to abandon her children at this moment. And take this scene, and now let's go do something about it. This kind of universalizing of women's experience and British women's use of this image of Indian women was also present 80 years later, still present 80 years later, when British women's rights advocate Sarah Amos said, quote, "We are struggling not just for English women alone, but for all the women, degraded, miserable, unheard of, for those whose life and happiness England has to answer daily to God." Right? So we're not just struggling for ourselves, we're struggling for our downtrodden sisters. In the process then, these women repeated the same types of stereotypes made in the 1830s and 40s, that Indian women were universally oppressed and in need of saving from the oppressive Indian men. This is despite the fact that there were Indian women who traveled to England and actually traveled to America. Pandita Ramanbai, on the picture on the right there, did several tours of the United States and was well known to groups like the US YWCA, who I studied. Other women, Cornelia Sorabaji and Rukmabi, all very prominent women's activists, Indian women's activists, who had these kinds of connections. But again, the problem here is they don't ask. The British women don't build those kinds of connections, so they end up speaking for, not with. Okay. In the last 15 minutes that I have here, I want to return back to Afghanistan. And I think that it's worth and I'm going to go over this briefly, but I think it's worth kind of bringing our attention back and reminding ourselves of how we got here. So during the Cold War, Afghanistan was part of the non-aligned nations. So first world is classified as the US and capitalist nations, second world is Soviet Union and communist nations, and third world is those who are obviously aligned with neither. And I sort of equate this to having two boyfriends or two girlfriends. You're getting courted from both sides, right? So in the case of Afghanistan, the US and Western European nations give things like roads. We build a lot of roads in Afghanistan. We help finance a dam in Helmand province. So we give a lot of aid, but it's not military aid because we are dancing around our relationship with Pakistan. And we don't want to anger Pakistan. So we're not going to give Afghanistan, which is right next door, military aid. So leaders go to the Soviet Union for this. So over the course of the Cold War, we have an Afghan military that is using Soviet weapons, has been trained in the Soviet Union, is developing these kinds of close ties. 1973, the king is overthrown by his cousin. And there's also, there's then a bunch of assassination attempts against Khan, including one, if I'm remembering correctly, that was a plan to blow up his toilet. I've got a book later that talks about that I'll show you. 1978, Afghanistan's Communist Party overthrows Khan, and then it begins to topple. So the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan in order to support this faltering communist regime, and that sets off the Soviet-Afghan War. So we have Cold War history coming into the Soviet invasion, and then the Soviet invasion really is a turning point for the things that will come after. In the course of the Soviet-Afghan War, the US provides aid, but we do it through kind of secret channels, back channels, through Pakistan. And we do it in things like textbooks that are developed by US universities, and that really present sort of a brutal image and a dehumanization of the Soviets. But bottom line is that Soviet-Afghan War causes a huge refugee crisis. And the people who would become the Taliban were students, Talibs, in these refugee camps. And they are, they're taught a particularly, what we might say is radical and kind of conservative version of Islam. Then Soviet Union falls. There is peace, in quotes, but Afghanistan soon devolves into a civil war between the Mujahideen and the Taliban. And it goes on, I would say more or less continuously. In 2001, as we know, the US invades and displaces the Taliban. But I think that these recent developments have taught us that they may not have been so displaced as we thought, right? So that's kind of the general backstory. Now that we can return to where I began women. And as I started with the two images that are on the left. But what we also need to remember is that, as Anand Gopal wrote in this New Yorker article, which is available for free, and I highly recommend that you read it. He did an interview on NPR, so you can just listen to the interview as well, even though the article's not that long. He reminds us that for women who are outside the cities, right, outside of these two places that we tend to see in photographs, for these women, it doesn't really matter who's in charge. You know, the Soviets invaded in 1979. If you are 40 years old or younger, you have lived in an Afghanistan that has been at war for your entire life. There's not the level of violence that people have experienced, as he talks about in this article, really means that all that they don't care about who's in charge. They care that they're not going to get shot or bombed by a drone or by a plane or by a suicide bomber. And that's something that we need to incorporate in our image, right, of Afghanistan and the situation that is going on today. So, big takeaways. Afghanistan is very diverse, and we need to be very careful about painting them with a broad brush, especially if we do that with the lens or with the paint of Orientalism, right? Like any other country, like any other people, Afghanistan is complex, and the people there are complex. There are people who support the Taliban, there are people who don't support the Taliban. There are Shia and Sunni, there are different ethnic minorities, it has deserts, it has mountains, right? So we need to recognize that this is complex. And that if we approach this through the lens of Orientalism, that's why we made mistakes in the past, and we will make those types of mistakes again. Second, we need to recognize that Afghan women have a choice. Even if the choice stinks, and even if it's a very limited choice, they do have choice, right? We need to not remove their this again is really hard. We have to speak with, not for. And as you watch the coverage, as you think about who to support, who to donate money to, if you're so moved to donate money, I would just advise that you look at the organizations very carefully, and that that we try as much as possible to get to these Afghan women's voices, and that we understand what they want, and that we honor that, right? Spreading democracy doesn't mean spreading democracy as I want you to practice it, right? It means I'm allowing you, I'm supporting you in whatever decision you make. That's a central, should be a central US tenet, it often is not. Okay. Finally, I have some sources for more information. I'm all right on time. I am so proud of myself. So if you are interested in these topics, you can of course look at my book, which is at the end there, but I did put myself at the end. So these are kind of in the order that I talked about them. If you're interested in the role that gender and sex played in French sovereignty in Algeria, there's the Circus book about that. Latah County talks about sati. Antoinette Burton talks about British feminists. A very readable overview of Afghan history is Games Without Rules. And Tamim Ansari actually came to WSU a couple of years ago. He's a delightful guy, so I can recommend him as an author as well. One of the interesting things, and I've debated about whether to throw in Peggy Pascoe's book, but I did anyway, because she talks about the same types of things that Antoinette Burton does, but in the American West. So if you're interested in this in a place that's a little bit closer to home, you might pick up her book. And I'll just make a general plug for her work. Her second book on interracial marriage is also very excellent. And then, of course, there's my book, which you can also pick up. It covers a broad range of topics, from the Spanish colonial officials in the New World, the transatlantic slave trade, Algeria, French Algeria and French Indochina, which would become Vietnam. And then, which is a fascinating topic. It's much cooler than it sounds. And then the last chapter is on Westerns and gender in Western films, and how the US projected certain ideas of masculinity and femininity, but then when that hit East Germany, we're all old enough here to remember that there was a West Germany and an East Germany. Is something I have to explain to my students. When this hit East Germany, the Westerns became different, and masculinity and femininity then also changed. So that's it. So thank you. If you have any questions, I can take them now. You have one. Okay, great.
Yes. So I recall very similar dynamics, the use of gender for imperial projects around the Spanish-American War, and this idea that we needed to save these poor women who were living under brutal Spanish colonial rule.
Yeah, absolutely.
So are there other examples that come to your mind?
No, yes, but that's an excellent example. And in fact, you've probably just remembered my advisor's book. So yeah, my advisor is Kristen Hoganson, and she wrote one of the books on how gendered language was used to provoke the war as well. So basically, senators and congressmen sitting around calling each other wimps right? Because nobody was going to vote for invasion. So yeah, absolutely. I would say absolutely, that's a really good example. I think it's a really kind of universal trope, right? That somebody somewhere is being victimized, women, and that that we need to step in. Somebody needs to step in and save them in some way. I think it's more common in the late 1800s, early 1900s, with that kind of benevolent imperialism and that move away from just, I'm going to take over this place because I can, to I'm going to take over this place in order to do this civilizational uplift, right? The white man's burden. So I think it probably comes more to the forefront in that. Yeah, but there's some really fascinating stuff with the other questions. Thank you, Dulcie. Yeah.
Yeah, I was really struck by talk about you just the last few minutes thinking about clothing, and I was thinking about the painting.
Yeah.
And the portrayal of women and this boy and their clothing or lack of
Right.
clothing.
Yeah.
And that's all about other people's portrayal of their clothing.
Right.
And I was thinking about rappers and maybe more recently, challenges to sort of gender binaries that we see in the streets of Moscow. And
yeah.
Like, do you see examples of people wearing clothing to challenge these norms? And can you talk about that if you do? To challenge like imperial, whatever.
Right.
Whatever.
Right. Certainly in Gandhi's case, clothing becomes a very obvious political statement. And it's interesting. The topic of clothing in India and